page to define each assumption in various different areas. So you could be talking about problem areas, or assumptions around your solution, assumptions around the problem, the target customer, marketing, key metrics. It allows you to just get that all out on one page and provides a lot of structure and guidance as you move throughout the whole process, so you know what you're actually trying to find out from the user research. Next slide, please. So a really interesting area is bias. It's kind of a word that we're all familiar with, but when I say bias here, I mean a trend or deviation from the truth in data collection, analysis, interpretation, publication, all these different areas. But anything like that that can cause you come into false conclusions. And with bias, it's really easy to be frightened by it and to be really worried about it and fearful. But I want to try and reduce that and say that it is always going to be present, but it's really about mitigating it because it's very difficult to get rid of. So we shouldn't be too concerned as long as we try to acknowledge, recognize, and control it wherever possible. So another area to get into the bias more specifically is one called selection and omission bias. And this can basically occur when your own personal bias or an organization's bias towards certain people that have certain characteristics end up defining your sample. And by sample, I mean the people that you are conducting the user research with or on or about. So the way this might play out is you might remove groups from your sample, and that might be by age or ethnicity or their experiences. And this is because you might have a personal leaning towards the idea that, well, this group might give us the best answers, or this group might be most willing to be involved, or this group might be the easiest to engage. And any of these biases can add complications to your research, in meaning that you don't have representative data of that general population. So one of the ways to mitigate against this is to be aware of those biases from the start, but also to carefully design the study to include those groups as well that might give you answers that don't support your assumptions or what you might want the outcome to be. Next slide, please. So this is my favorite one, social desirability bias, AKA people-pleasing bias. So this is basically when participants might respond inaccurately so that they could be better liked or more accepted. And this crops up particularly in cases where you're asking sensitive questions or personal or controversial topics. We all want to be liked, but it's up to us as researchers or people conducting the user research to try and provide an environment where people are comfortable to give their own opinions. So one of the ways to mitigate against this bias is to phrase the questions in a way that allows the participant to feel accepted no matter what the answer is. So no leading questions that suggest that you want to hear a particular answer. The other way is to not make it directly known what your desired outcome is. It's a lot it's a lot harder to please somebody when you don't know what it is that they want you to tell them. So those are two ways that you can mitigate that. And my final slide, please. Thank you very much. So I'm going to run a tiny bit over. But confirmation bias is, I'd say, probably the most common bias and one of the most difficult to avoid. And it's simply put that an organization may accidentally interpret the data to support their assumptions or hypotheses, what we laid out right at the start. It also might be that you might omit data that doesn't favor that assumption or hypothesis. This can all happen unconsciously or consciously. It's very easy to do. One of the best ways to mitigate against it, again, is to be aware of that bias right at the start. So you know what you want the assumptions to be. So why don't you take an extra step to look at what the data might be that doesn't support that and see how valid that is when you're looking at your results. Another one is to have someone review the data that doesn't know the desired outcome to see if they come to the same conclusions as you. That way you would be, your findings would be less biased because they were verified by somebody else. And I think that's me. Thank you very much. I hope you were able to learn something.
Great. Thank you so much, Josh. That was brilliant. Yeah, really interesting kind of within the life cycle of user research, how bias can really intersect across the whole of that life cycle, right at the beginning, but also when you're doing your analysis and when you're kind of implementing different solutions as well. Great. So our next speaker is Cam. Cam's the director and co-founder of Paper, which is a research and design studio. He's also co-founder and mentor for Leg Up Social, which is a free-to-attend digital mentoring network for anyone who needs to learn digital skills, and a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. As a user researcher, he's worked with government, charity and local authority services, and most recently he's been doing research with people who have experienced homelessness who want to begin or restart a career. Another project he's been doing has been researching with people who have experienced misogynistic harassment online. Great, thank you so much, Cam.
Hi everyone. When I had a chat with the panelists and catalysts, I said I'd talk a little bit about recruitment, or how you might find people to do research with. And I suppose with user research, there's lots of processes, tools, templates, governance, and everything that you could dig into. But instructions can be quite easy to forget. So when we're coaching people in user research, we start with the fundamentals of how to ask unbiased questions and how to spot assumptions. And that can apply to figuring out how to do your recruitment. So for instance, 3 useful questions you might ask at the start of a recruitment process. What is the question that we're trying to answer with this research? So is that question too broad? Is it narrow enough that we're going to learn something? Is it the highest priority question for our organisation? Number 2, you might ask, how are we going to find people to participate? And I'll go into a bit more detail about that in a sec. And then number 3, how are you going to reassure those people and keep them safe during the process? So those are 3 good questions to start with. In our experience, like asking each of these questions can either lead to more detailed questions, which you can answer as an organisation, or eventually they'll start delivering some decisions that you're comfortable with. I think it's a better way to approach a plan than just taking something off the shelf and assuming it sort of fits. So going back to that question about how you might find people to participate, again, at least some more detailed questions. Who do you need to speak with and how many people? Although that how many people thing is a trap. I would start with the idea that speaking to one person is better than speaking to none. You then might also ask who might struggle the most to access our service. If you think about it, you could test with people who frequently use your services, and that might validate that they're successful. It might help you find some nuance, but really the people who struggle the most are the ones that you might want to prioritise for your research. A similar question to that is, who's actually less likely to be heard in this process? That's a really tricky one in recruitment, because if they're less likely to be heard, they're often more difficult to find, right? But you can think about the characteristics of those people. So who's less likely to have a voice? You might think about people who are excluded for one reason or another. Maybe if it's an English service, people who have English as a second language, for instance, might feel less confident about speaking. Then you can ask, how do we make sure people are willing to take part, and how do we compensate them for their time? So I suppose you might have come across the people calling it incentives. We might pay people something like, I don't know, 50 quid, 70 quid or so for 45 minutes of their time, but not everyone can do that, and it depends on the project. And you know, if you're skin, then I'd say the principle is to see it as some sort of transaction. So even if you can only offer a token, offer something to show that you appreciate the time that you're being given. And then you might ask, how do we make our recruitment questions inclusive? Because you might use a form or something, you might need to know about gender or ethnicity, things that are quite hotly sort of debated. But if you can start with the idea of putting yourself in the participant's shoes, what might make them feel that they were excluded from this research and not able to take part, is a good place to start. And then finally, it seems like a bit of a negative one, but ask the question about, well, what happens if this goes wrong? And I know that sounds negative, but I think it can really help you feel more confident about doing user research. If you know who a participant would contact if they're unhappy, how that gets processed, how you learn from it and iterate your approach, then actually you can quite confidently then do user research and even experiment. Once you do some user research, you might find a lot of this stuff is reusable, and we've built a user research pattern library. But if you go back to those fundamentals, even the most experienced user researchers at paper look at those patterns and still start by asking unbiased questions and trying to spot assumptions. I'm happy to share those patterns, by the way. Anyway, thank you. That's everything from me.
Great, thank you so much, Cam. It's so interesting and just really highlights the importance of recruitment right at the beginning of user research and how that has such a big impact on the results you get and the basically impact that has on your solution at the end. So thank you so much for that. Great, so our next speaker is Katherine. Katherine's head of user research at Monzo. Monzo is an online bank whose mission is to make money work for everyone. Before joining Monzo, she led user research at Citizens Advice and Marks and Spencer's. Katherine also helps charities launch remote digital inclusion programs for isolated service users through Digital Candle. She mentors people facing difficulties with addiction, homelessness and dementia with 2 local charities called the Association of Jewish Refugees and Bridging the Gap Islington. Great, thank you so much, Katherine.
Hi, thanks for having me. So I've just posted a question in the chat, actually. I'd love to find out a little bit more about the people on the call. But I wanted to know how many people work in your charities or organizations, whether it's just you or 10 people or 100, because I can kind of take that into account when I'm talking about what I'm talking about. But while you ping me back, I just wanted to take a step back and talk about why we do user research and what we're trying to achieve. Essentially, at its core, we're trying to understand what our clients and service users need and experience and want so that we can build better services and, without sounding too like Miss World about it, like make their lives better. And it's a big job and it can feel incredibly overwhelming to ask big questions and to be able to come up with good answers if you're the only person involved. And it's really interesting seeing some of your responses to this. Most people on the call are like in the dozens. There's one or two people who have less than 10 people in the organization, but most people have others in their organization. And I just wanted to take this as an opportunity to talk to you about how you can make the most of your team when you're doing research and bring them on the journey with you in a way that means that your research findings kind of stick. So if we go to the next slide, please. Having the team involved as much as possible isn't just helpful to you. It builds empathy across the whole organization. And it helps finding stick in people's memory when you hear a story from somebody directly. Often it just stays with you in a way that having it reported back to you doesn't always. It means that analysis is more robust, excuse me. Joshua, like everyone actually so far has already talked about bias in research, and having lots of people involved means that the questions that we ask and the analysis that we do is it reduces the bias involved. And having people involved also means that the solutions that you come up with are as practical and actionable as possible, because the stakeholders who'll be implementing some of those changes will be on the journey with you and involved in like coming up with those answers. So if we go to the next slide, please. So how do we get people involved when everyone's stretched between 100 things, especially in those smaller organizations? The first thing is make sure that your stakeholders know what research you're doing and what you're trying to achieve. And whenever possible, my recommendation would be always bring that back to the charity's overarching goals wherever you can. Share your plans and your scripts or anything that you're planning to share with the participant early and ask for stakeholders' feedback on the plans. Do they have questions that they'd like you to ask? Do they think that the focus of the research should be slightly different? It can sometimes feel a little bit like it slows you down to get too much feedback at the beginning of the process. But what I would say is having stakeholders be able to shape the research questions that you ask and to be really bought into the goal of the research that you're delivering means that they'll be bought into the success of the outcome as well. And they'll really want to kind of go the extra mile to make sure that any solutions that you recommend or ideas that you come up with can actually get implemented. Make it super easy for team members to get involved when everyone's so busy. Put the sessions in people's diaries, share any links or instructions for how to join that will be easy for them to read initially, but also really easy for them to find when they notice in their diary they're supposed to be in a research session in 1 minute's time. Make it really easy for them to work out how to get there. And be specific about how you want help from people and why you want help from specific people in the team. Sometimes it can feel like you're like shouting about research, come join, come get involved. And it's hard to get much back when people are super busy. And I found that if you actually break it down, in all honesty, each individual person will bring something unique that you would love them to bring to the research. Like I would just say, direct message them, grab them in the corridor if you're working in person and just say, I would love you to be there because I'd love you to bring this point of view. And I think it would really add something to the questions that we're asking. So that's kind of how to get people involved. If we go on to the next slide, if you're having people observe live, first make sure that participants have given consent to take part in the research. That's kind of just applicable in all research. And in your consent form, and when you say hello to them, just make sure that they know that you have observers listening in as well. And when you introduce that, it doesn't need to sound too intimidating. I often just say, thanks so much for joining. I actually have a colleague who's listening in as well. She's frantically taking notes so I can give you my full attention. And participants are usually really comfortable with that. If participants have any issue with it whatsoever, just let them know. They can let you know, and you don't need to have observers there, and that's fine. And observers can watch back later. So it's always about judging what the participants are comfortable with, but I've actually never had a situation where a participant has asked not to have observers watching along as well. There's 1,000 ways that you can set things up so your team can watch along. If you're doing it in person, you can have somebody join you. It's okay to have a second person in the room taking notes. Again, bear in mind what the participant's thinking and feeling, and if you think they'll be overwhelmed or it might affect what they're sharing with you, limit it to just yourself or one other person. If you want to have more people involved and you're doing it in person, some companies have labs where they have cameras and like those mirrors that you see in detective programs, and that all set up. You don't need to have that perfect setup to be able to have people observing in a next room. You can just set up a laptop, have a Google Hangout running and just stream it to the next room, and then everyone next door can have kind of a watching party with like snacks and note taking. So you don't really need like a fancy setup to be able to do that well. I'm talking about in person, but obviously so much is remote at the moment and probably will be for the foreseeable. There's lots of professional software to host user research, and you'll probably have heard of a lot of it, like user Zoom and user testing and Look Back. If you have the budget, they're great tools, but you don't need them. Again, you can actually do a lot just with tools like Zoom and Google. If you have Google Workplace, you can use something called live stream, which allows you to just stream into a separate Hangout, which people can watch along with. If you don't have any of that, it's absolutely fine to just have an extra person in whatever Hangout kind of call conferencing tool that you use, and have them record their screen and just share it into another Hangout that they're sitting with other people. So I think there's loads of ways to technically set these things up, but you just need to remember that as long as the participants are informed and comfortable and the team know how to get involved, then you're onto a winner. If you go on to the next slide. Finally, I just wanted to mention how to make the most of observers when you have them there and keep them really engaged. Get your observers to take notes. There's loads of different ways to take notes during research, and a lot of this kind of feeds into how to make the most of research sessions just generally. Once you have a really clear sense of the research questions you're asking and the goal of the research, you can have a assumptions matrix which outlines kind of everything that you're looking for, so you can just go through and say, yes, participant was able to do this, no, participant was not able to do this, and at the end you have a really neat, beautiful kind of grid of success and fail. If actually what you're doing is a bit more broad, you can have your observers take notes verbatim. It's really powerful to take notes verbatim because you get the genuine quotes of the people rather than having the note-taking bias of whoever's kind of summarizing as you go. And the other thing you can do is have kind of like a post-it note wall, and in remote working, there are loads of ways to duplicate that as well. So Google Jamboard is a really nice tool, whimsical, or you could even just use kind of a shared slide deck. If you create a little post-it note and duplicate it and let people keep their notes and you can organize those in analysis together, then the team will be really keen to discuss what they've written, because once you've kind of engaged in people's stories, it's very difficult to kind of leave them just with the researcher to look at afterwards. So in summary, there's no one size fits all for getting teams involved. You'll all have very different levels of time and money, and we're talking to people who are from organizations of 5 people up to hundreds. And you'll all have different questions you want to answer. But in summary, if you give the team a chance to feed in, and if you have them getting involved in observing and note-taking, your research findings will be really likely to stick. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Katherine. Yeah, completely echo having your team involved. Great, so now we have Eileen. So Eileen works at MSF, which is, sorry if my accent's not very good, Médecins Sans Frontières, as a digital advisor, where she works with communication teams worldwide to enhance their digital presence. She's worked for more than 10 years on digital and strategic communications in the UK's not-for-profit and media sector. Before joining MSF, Eileen was the digital manager at the ODI, which is the Overseas Development Institute, which is a think tank researching the humanitarian and development sector. She's also done digital communications for peace building, the NGO Conciliation Resources, Amnesty International, and lots of other organisations. She's worked as a journalist and researcher in Colombia, where she is, sorry, my thing suddenly cut out, where she is originally from.
Yes.
There we go. Also, just to mention as well that you're part of the leadership team for digital charities Slack forum, which I will put the link in the chat, which is a brilliant Slack forum. Slack is just an instant messaging kind of platform where lots of charities, people who work in charities and some people who work in agencies, freelancers, can ask lots of different questions about lots of different things that they might be experiencing, that they might be having difficulty with, but also just to have other people in the community who know what they're going through as well. Great, thank you so much, Eileen.
Thank you for that fantastic introduction, Cecilia, and hi everyone. So I thought I will be sharing with you something from my experience within the charities. And I wanted to start with a reflection. I think we know that digital communications and user research, digital is not just for creating websites or products or posting social media, but it's actually as well about bringing people with you on maybe changing process, testing tools, updating services, and enable people to help themselves. But that happens not just with our external audiences, but as well within our own organizations. So why not considering using user research techniques within your organizations? So that's what I will be chatting in the next 5 minutes with you. So next slide, please. So the example I will be using is I was tasked in MSF to help the organization to deal better with social media crisis. So that was the task. It's quite big, and they were like, we don't know what is going to be the shape or what is the outcome, but can you please have a look at it? And I thought, wow, I don't know where to start. And then I went back to the time when I was website project manager, and I thought we always used to start from the user. So yes, let's use user research to tackle this challenge as well. So next slide, please. What I thought is, okay, yes, user research can give me a really good framework to understand, the users, which in this case are people within the organization dealing with a social media crisis. They will help me to understand their needs, but also their behaviors, which is very crucial, their attitudes and their motivations, and actually produce something that is useful, not maybe a paper or a workflow or a process that will sit in a folder and nobody will ever use. So I decided to take the following 4 steps using some of the user research techniques to do that. Next, please. So I wanted, as I said, I wanted to create something, a framework, a toolkit, something that was useful for everyone. And I wanted to include a diverse group of users into helping me design that. So in this case, I thought, okay, social media is not just for comms department. So we need to identify who else is part of a crisis during a social media crisis. So we may have people from human resources, finance, or maybe some project managers of our operations that are happening in the countries. So we need to have that diversity, but also we need to be inclusive in terms of seniority. And that's something that Joshua was saying at the beginning. We need to think who may not have a voice in this type of process. So we know maybe a social media crisis may involve the executive director of an organization, but also maybe somebody that is more junior in an entry-level position, or somebody that is at the forefront, maybe managing the social media channels and having that that insight. So making sure we had that at different levels of seniority was key. Also, the organization where I work is international, and I wanted to ensure that we had a diverse background, so different languages and different places where people come from, to really demonstrate that diversity. And then also the final point was we need to consider the level of experience of people and exposure that they may have had with social media crisis, so maybe low, medium, high. So with all of these ingredients, next slide, please. It took me to the second step, which where I used something to learn what people are doing now. So I did some observation visits, but it was during COVID, so it was all virtual. But it meant that, as Katherine was saying, I was joining some sessions, some briefings. I was copying the emails. I was part of the reports that were submitted, and I was just part of the conversation, just a passive observer, making notes and seeing how people behave. But I have to complement that with one-to-one interviews, because that really helped me to get detailed information of people's motivation, desires, challenges, and that helped me to shape that. So next slide, please. So now I had enough information of that group of users, and I also had enough information maybe from external resources on how to deal with a social media crisis. So I put all of that information together, but I wanted to keep it, making it relevant to the needs of the organization. So I was sending some surveys after we had some crisis to different teams that were dealing with them, to really take and learn from their experience while the knowledge was fresh. And then another element I was doing was I was developing some specific task, or maybe testing a couple of tools and saying to people, can you test this? Can you do that? And I was accompanying them in one-to-one. And the last step, next slide, yeah, thank you, is around piloting what I develop and keep testing it and optimizing it. So I'm still running some simulations where I created a crisis, and I bring a group session online together via Zoom, where during 90 minutes, I develop a crisis and I give them the toolkit, and I see how they use it, what are the behaviors, and what we can do to improve it. I have a person that helps me to facilitate the session, so I can really focus on observing how they are doing it. So those are the steps and some of the techniques I have used, and I will be happy to talk to you and learn as well from your experiences on implementing some of these techniques. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Eileen. Really interesting. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, all the speakers so far. Great, so now we're going to move over to the Q&A session part of the event. So if people can put their videos on, that would be fantastic, so we can see lots of lovely, friendly faces. Yeah, and I'm going to start with some of the questions that came into the Slido. I suppose also one quick question that I'd like to put to the panel is, quite a lot of you have spoken about different types of user research, and at different points of when you're in the development of different products, when you're doing your user research. So for example, some of you are showing prototypes, some of you might do user research right at the beginning. Can you explain a tiny little bit about the differences between maybe some of the possible types of user research that the different people here could take part in, or could conduct essentially? Katherine, if that's all right, I'll start with you.
So that's sort of just an intro to the different methods that, so I think people often, when they say user research, often they mean user interviews. User interviews are a big part of user research, and a really powerful way of finding out things that you don't know. They're probably one of the easiest methods to set up. And they're probably, although there's a skill that you build over time of doing unbiased interviews, which is really valuable, they're also easy for anyone to deliver. So user research, user interviews is a really good kind of starting point. Another big one is usability testing, where you essentially share some visuals or a live product or service with somebody, and you watch them go through the process, and as much as possible you try not to interrupt them, and you observe how easy or difficult it is for them to use what you're providing for them. And what's really amazing about that is, going back to the different biases that Joshua was mentioning before, actually seeing somebody struggle with the site tells you a lot more than them telling you it's fine, it does the job. And I think that's particularly helpful when we're talking about services that an individual would get for free, and particular groups who might actually not expect services to work particularly well for them, who have quite low expectations. And so being able to talk to users who might be really grateful for the service that you're providing, but also see them using the service and see where it breaks, is a really powerful tool. And then there's a range of others which help you organize information. If you're interested in how to organize information in your website, for instance, you can use card sorts and tree testing. They're really functional and quick to set up, and they're really focused on making sure the way you organize your information is easy to find. So yeah, I guess that's a few. I would say, in summary, if you're starting out with user research, user interviews are a brilliant place to start. And then from there, you can work out more and more defined research questions and then work out the most appropriate method from there.
Great. Does anyone else have anything to add on that one?
Yeah, Eileen touched on it a little when she mentioned surveys. So one of the great benefits of surveys that is a little trickier with user interviews is just being able to reach such a large amount of people, depending on how difficult they are to find, reach a lot of people in one go. It also has its benefits if you're looking for statistical data. It's easier to come by that data using that method. I think one of the things that is overlooked sometimes with surveys is their usefulness in combination with other methods. So a great thing, Katherine was kind of talking about usability testing or those methods, but you could throw up a landing page or throw up the product, get them to use it, and then you can use a survey in conjunction with that. Or you might have run a survey with them based on what your product or what your idea or whatever you were trying to test beforehand, and see how that data compares after they've interacted with it. So it's a really versatile tool, you know, for comparison as well as one-off information, although user research should never be one-off.
Great, yeah, that kind of leads us on to the question. Is there anything else you should be doing to complement user research, analytics, surveys, stakeholder mapping, etc.? Cam, I'm going to get you.
Okay, I was just listening to Joshua's answer and thinking that's perfect. That's exactly it. It really depends on the research question that you're trying to answer. It's kind of tricky as well because you don't. So you can use mixed methods and pull it together, but sometimes it can be quite difficult to find the links between one data set and then another. So that's one thing to be mindful of, is you're trying to predict ahead, like I'm going to get these surveys answers, they're going to tell me what problem is, and then I'm going to do something qualitative and I'm going to see what the different sort of fractal parts of that problem is, and then I need to connect those things. So that can be quite challenging. The other thing is you don't want to collect data you're not going to use either. So it does mean you have to be quite picky, and surveys in particular are really tricky because you get to the end of a survey and it's only then often that you see, oh, I know what I should have asked. So you need to go back and do it again. But again, Joshua answered that like brilliantly. The way you do it is you sort of do a little bit of survey work, do a little bit of user research, uncover what the problems are, a little bit of usability, like test some ideas, and then capture it back on the other side once you've got something up and running, and do again some maybe exit surveys or something like that. So it does that service work as people expected it to.
Great. So one thing that always comes up is you've done all this user research, great, you've kind of got past that hurdle, you've now got all this information. What do you actually do with it? How do you turn that into something that's really helpful and useful for your organization, because I know that lots of people struggle to actually turn it into something that is kind of tangible and kind of actionable. So yeah, if this is open to everyone, if you could give some kind of tips or tricks about how you can kind of make that transition, that would be amazing. Yeah, Cam.
I'll have a go. It depends what you've got. So if you're doing user interviews, I think Katherine described it, you've got loads of quotes down verbatim, for instance. What you could do is look at each one of those interviews and you'd get loads of individual ideas. But if you moved all of those quotes over to a different space and started trying to pull them together into groups, that's something that some people might call affinity mapping or clustering or analysis, or, I mean, yeah, apologies for all of the jargon, but it's just like getting them together into a group. And that group, when you see them together, you might be able to describe that as something that you might say, well, that's a theme. These all seem to be saying sort of the same thing. But you also might be able to draw out from that something like, here's a pain point or a number of pain points, here's what people are finding difficult. And then from that, you might be able to say, okay, well, can I really describe what these people need? Are they expressing what they all need to solve this problem? And that you might write that as a user need. There's more, but it's having those categories. Another thing that can come out of those groups and can be really helpful if you look at it and go, why isn't this making sense? Is you could arrive at just further hypotheses, like further ideas. So it's not making sense, but it gives me a clue. I don't want to say this is a definite validated need. So how would I write this as a further question to go back and ask a bit more? So that's why, and I think, sorry, I've forgotten who was talking about it. That's why when you're doing research, it's great to do it iteratively. Do a bit, analyze a bit, see whether you're getting closer, because then you might want to tweak your next iteration of research a little bit. So I didn't quite get some validated needs, but I've got an idea. I've got a clue of what I need to find out next, as it were. So that's one way, but it depends what data you've got. If you've already got a live service and you're getting data, you might want to start attaching that data to the steps in the service and saying what's happening at this point, what's happening at this point. So it depends what sort of data you've got, depends on what sort of analysis you might do. And those are just two examples.
Yeah, Eileen, what are your kind of thoughts on that one?
Yes, no, I think, yeah, I think Cam was covering some excellent points. And I think for me is sometimes I try to identify or quick wins or small things that are doable. Because I think if you get to a point of like, I have too much, maybe it's something around the scope when you were doing your user research and you need to go back as well to a question like, why did I do this? What was the purpose of it? And I think it can get overwhelming. I mean, believe me, sometimes I have so much data that I'm like, I don't know where to start. And then I just go back to that initial question, why? Okay, that. Okay, and sometimes during the research, you find quick wins and you can start to implement or make small tweaks that already make a big difference. So that could be one way to start to make it into practice. And I think it just gives you and your team a boost of showing the actual results of that. But when that's not possible, then is you just go back and think why, and just start to cluster and identify into topics as Cam was saying. So I think that will be my thoughts for that.
Katherine, you mentioned kind of that thing where you were saying kind of success or failure. What would you go into kind of for that analysis of that research?
Yeah, so that would be a really good tool to use if you were trying to test whether a service or a product was meeting users' needs and allowing them to do what you expected them to be able to do on it. So if, for instance, you had something online which allowed people to sign up for a service, you might have particular expectations of that tool, which might be users are able to find out what this service is, users are able to choose a time that suits them, and users are able to put their information in so that they can successfully book a slot, and then users know when they have successfully booked a slot. So you might have a few criteria for that tool being a successful tool. And then during usability, you can create that sort of a grid so that throughout the process, you can very objectively say, the user obviously wasn't able to do that, or the user was able to book a session, but the user did not know that they had booked a session. And after you've spoken to 5 or 6 people, which is a really good amount of people to start to see themes and patterns with quite a lot of confidence, you can see the pattern emerge that, okay, these are the parts of the tool which are working really well. People know how to get here, people know what it is, but this part of the tool isn't meeting people's needs. And then you can make some quite actionable kind of recommendations and ideas for improving that aspect of the tool which isn't meeting needs. The other tool that I wanted to mention, which might be helpful if you have started doing broader discovery work and then out the other side you're a bit no idea where to go next, is kind of applying how might we statements, which allow you to kind of make sense of problem statements that you have, but that it's hard to know what to do next. So I'll link something to that as well, but it's a really nice way of turning around insights into a framing that allows you to think, okay, we have a writer, or we have an engineer, or we have just me, how might we solve this problem? And then how might we do that in a way that meets the resources and the time and the people that we have?
Yeah, that's great. How might we's are so useful, especially when sometimes you might want to jump to a solution and you kind of have to rein yourself back before you start jumping to the solution and kind of look at it from lots of different aspects. Joshua, is there anything that you could be doing right at the beginning to make that step a little bit easier?
The specific step around how might we's, or
about analysing the research at the end?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I think this is something that Cam mentioned really early on in one of his questions in saying, why are you conducting the research? And it's been touched upon by everyone. I think one of the clear things is that sometimes it's not as simple as it's only being the single question, but if you're able to understand what those key research questions are, and that's decided on an organization basis, it's what do we want to find out, because we know, or at least we believe, that the answers to these questions will allow us to go on to do X thing or make X decision. If you can note those out, the secret to getting the answer to those, it's not a big secret, but it's deriving you know, your interview or your survey questions from that research question. So you go, all these questions I've asked can competently answer this research question. And whatever that outcome is at the end, it may be positive, it may not. But at least you're able to come away with that with clear conclusions. The one thing I think sometimes that even we ourselves can miss, we're all very focused on what people did say, but it's often what people don't say that also tells us a great deal. We're looking for that thing that says, no, they do want it. And it's like, actually the whole way through, nobody said that they did want it. So there are thematic themes that you can notice on the top. And then there's also an undercurrent of what are the things that nobody cared about talking about? Because that might dismiss one of those products or solution ideas or something that you had in the back of your head and go, hey, we gave them all the opportunity to mention it, nobody did.
Yeah, that's so important in a team. Sometimes you can get fixated on something really small, and then in user research, no one notices it, no one mentions it. You're like, oh, maybe it's not as important as we originally thought it was. Great, I'm just gonna have a few like super quick fire questions. So I'll probably just do one person per question. So how much should you script user research in advance, and how much should you go with the flow? Catherine, if we can get you on this one.
I think this one depends a lot on what you're trying to achieve. If you're doing genuine discovery research, if you're talking about a whole new kind of branch of your organization or something that's not really defined yet, I think it's like an amazing opportunity to go into an interview and just have maybe 3 key questions and a few talking points, and then you can riff around them, and then you're most likely to find out the things that you had never planned that you would find out. If you're any way further along, then I think it comes back again to what you're trying to achieve through the research and making sure that you have a few key questions in any script that you know will give you signal on the questions that you want to be confident answering by the end of the day of testing or the week or the round or whatever. So it comes back to what you're trying to look for. If you're genuinely trying to find something completely new, I think it's like a brilliant, like, it's a brilliant thing to go in without too much, like, without bringing too much for the person to tell you, just like letting them tell the story. But if you have quite like rigid research goals, that's when it's really helpful to have those questions. And I would add to that as well, there's a real skill in working out what questions will give you signal. People who have been researchers for many decades, and myself included in this, I write research questions and survey questions that do not get the signal that I was expecting at all. And people just respond in a completely different way. So I think one really helpful thing is to just soft launch any questions that you ask, any questions that you're planning to ask, either in a survey or in an interview with one or two people who are either ideally in your kind of target group or anyone really, and just check that they understand the question to mean the same thing that you do, so that when you then start rolling it out with the majority of people, you're quite confident that you know the sort of answers that you'll get back, and it's going to get you the signal that you need.
Okay, great. Cool. So all the different questions that people have in their heads, please keep those in your heads for the moment. We're going to break out into breakout rooms. And yeah, it'll be with each person from the panel, and you'll be able to dive a little bit deeper into some of the questions you might have. Also, you might want to ask a little bit more about their experience or their history or anything like that. Yeah, so we will send you into breakout rooms now.